to all of you. I am absolutely humbled to have you all join me today. This experience is somewhat surreal for me for at least two reasons. First, because I've never imagined a future where I'd be addressing so many scholars and educators from different places around the world. Others in my life might have anticipated this sort of future for me, and certainly there are others for whom speaking to this kind of crowd might seem outright mundane. But I still fundamentally experience life as a troublemaking child and student who constantly questioned authority and people and ideas, then become a troublemaking adult and educator who constantly questioned authority and people and ideas, now become a professor, normatively tasked with maintaining hierarchies of people and ideas, except I still feel like that student, only wearing the clothes of a professor. Second, this experience is really surreal because I'm discussing a topic that's held great personal significance throughout my life, especially as someone who is, very blind to sort of social norms. It takes me a lot of time and conscious attention to even understand them. So things like the way emotion is treated within our disciplinary space was very confusing to me in some very real sense, both as a teacher and later as a grad student and now researcher. And having the space to discuss it is incredibly wonderful. Many thanks to everyone who came together in the development of this research institution, which explicitly and intentionally carves out space for research and modes of research otherwise relegated to the margins of mathematics education. So this talk is going to go on for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then the floor is going to open for responses and discussion. And it's my sincere hope that this talk will prompt comments, critiques, and observations from many of you. I really want you to participate. For me, this is sort of an ongoing collaborative project, even though this particular moment is centered around me talking for a few minutes. Like many pieces of writing, this one morphed and warped under my feet right up until the very end. I've tried very hard to take into account the sorts of people who are registering in the construction of it. So for example, there were many more registrants from math departments than I would have casually expected, considering the abstract that I put out. And so I made some adjustments to incorporate some really intentional discussion about mathematics itself. So yeah, my primary purpose today is to discursively explore the roles and positions anger is relegated to in mathematics education, and to imagine more productive futurities for how we might re-envision anger as a tool rather than as an obstacle. Even though in my day-to-day life, I'm an anarchist activist who does lots of things like organizes, community gardens and baby pantries and lots of active stuff like that. Theory is really important. In a lot of, for example, American liberal political activism, theory is totally absent, but if you're involved in leftist activist spaces, you'll find it plays a key role. The idea sort of underlying that is, if you really wanted to build a house, it would be a bad idea to just go grab some boards of wood and start hammering nails into them. Like, that's not helpful. You got to have a blueprint. You got to learn about the materials, the tools. You got to learn how to put everything together. And that's the role that theory potentially serves. So before I begin, I'll say a few words about the manner in which I'm going to convey thoughts today, because the forms we convey ideas themselves have affordances and constraints which deserve attention and critical consideration, especially from those who willingly or unwillingly bear the moral responsibility of being generators and communicators of knowledge, teachers and researchers. After all, the medium is the message, and we are all subject to the tyranny of genre, especially when we don't treat form with the consideration it deserves, considering how central it is to how meaning-making works in human terms. Now, I don't want this preamble to take unduly away from time spent considering our primary purpose, so I'll confine myself to a good enough explanation here. In short, the most common norms of communication in formal spaces of mathematics education intentionally temper consideration and discussion of anger and various other emotional entanglements that we almost definitionally engage with as a byproduct of being human beings, learning from other human beings and their practices. Consequently, Discussing my topic of focus today demands that I, at times, lean into communicative norms, the ways of speaking and writing that are outside of the various norms we generally take for granted in mathematics education, or mathematics itself. Furthermore, in keeping with the goals of CPPI-ME, our research institute, our audience today represents a broad spectrum of experienced researchers, emerging researchers, graduate students, current practitioners, and even folk outside of math education, coming from countries around the world. So bearing all that in mind, in moments where I diverge from typical communicative norms, the broad lessons informing those deviations today are drawn from my reading of Audre Lorde, not just because she's one of the most impactful philosophers and genre pushers of our time, but also because she's one of the few scholars I've seen treat our topic today as one worthy of due consideration. Lorde diverged sharply from the generally Western white-collar white men who shaped the foundations of many of our contemporary institutions of mathematics and education. So whereas Descartes, for example, and his like would draw a firm line between our minds and our bodies and feelings, Lorde never had that privilege. She was always all at once Black and queer and disabled and a communist, compelled at every moment of her life to face how her embodied humanity shaped her experiences in visible and visceral terms. And this comes across beautifully and thought-provokingly in how her writings attend to embodied experiences. For anyone here today who is interested in philosophy and has not read people like Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks, I absolutely encourage you to do that. So though I've never claimed to be able to write or speak like Audre Lorde, I am applying lessons learned from her in how I communicate and structure parts of my talk today. I will at times be poetic. I will center my etic lens, my outsider lens as an activist. And I will leverage my own embodied experiences as a way of analyzing and making sense of culture, and especially the culture of our discipline. Regarding centering my own embodied experiences, one of my goals is that by the end of this talk, many of you will know at least a little more about autism and a neuroqueer experience than you do right now. It's my hope that this approach to the form of the talk today will also work to support our diverse audience, especially in the sense that centering some of my embodied experiences might provide a pretty straightforwardly human connection that is hopefully accessible to all of us, that we can leverage in our own ways towards meaningful sense-making. To that observation, I'll add that it has been a great pleasure for me these past few years to see a growing contingent of new and emerging math ed practitioners and researchers exploring ways of knowing and modes of expression previously excluded from the formal epistemological and axiological sanction of our discipline. It is my hope that this talk today energizes those of you so aligned to continue that exploration, while also maybe giving you some immediate fodder for thought as you contemplate the role form takes in explicitly and tacitly shaping the meanings that we even can make from talks, articles, and so forth. So let's talk about alexithymia and mathematics education, when we can't name our feelings. So let's begin by thinking about what anger is and what it does. What does it communicate? What can it reveal to us? How is it treated in a space? As alluded to several times already, I'm neurodivergent, minimally a prismatic conflagration of autism and ADHD, states of neurological being that in recent history have been pathologized, fetishized, and commodified ad nauseum. One of the most immediately interesting things about building this talk around connections to my own embodied experiences is that one of the loci of pathology, fetish, and commodity in how society interprets and treats autistic people is emotion. I'm going to take a moment to give some attention to clinical descriptions of autism and some of the constituent misunderstandings to which they have given rise, as I think important context. Autistic people are commonly alexithymic, with more than half of those diagnosed fitting the criteria for that description. Literally translating this word from its Greek roots gives rise to a meaning along the lines of no words for emotions, alexithymic. We obviously have feelings, but naming them does not always come easily. Even as an adult with literal years of experience at feeling, processing, and naming my emotions, it can still take me hours, days, or even weeks to name my feelings in a way that I feel does justice to the emotions I'm feeling. Now, I say it's obvious that we have feelings, but arguably society proves me wrong here. A substantial amount of research on autistic people in recent decades has described us as lacking a theory of mind, suggesting broadly that we don't feel real emotions, and also that we can't conceive of other people as true humans who feel true emotions. This painfully omnipresent narrative has contributed a great deal of violence to autistic people, painting us as less than human, as potentially violent or dangerous, and so forth. Perception is dangerous to us all, but especially to those with additional layers of intersectional minoritization, such as autistic women of color, who, I will add, also experience additional barriers to diagnosis and disability accommodations, since research and public perception has historically centered its lens on people who are white and assigned male at birth. The irony, such as it is that the truth is roughly the opposite. Recent research has done some work towards reframing this. So first, we can distinguish cognitive empathy from affective empathy. Affective empathy is feeling what another feels, whereas cognitive empathy is understanding thought processes that might give rise to those feelings. So recent research has more accurately reframed prior theories of autistic empathy in terms of the double empathy problem, which says roughly that autistic people naturally and easily can cognitively empathize with other autistic people, but have barriers to cognitively empathizing with neurotypical people. Whereas neurotypical people naturally and easily cognitively empathize with other neurotypical people, but experience barriers to cognitive empathy with autistic people. Furthermore, research on affective empathy, feeling what another feels, provides strong evidence of a surfeit in autistic people. We tend to affectively hyper-empathize, and this hyper-empathy extends to people and animals and plants and even non-living things like toys or ideas. One good piece of starter advice for neurotypical parents of autistic children is that their kids will not just mirror their emotions, but amplify them. For reasons like this, it's no surprise that other neurodivergencies like borderline personality disorder are common misdiagnoses for autistic people in primary care settings. So, having given some attention to sort of clinical description and constituent misunderstandings, let's return to considering what autism is and what it isn't. Now, obviously, the experiences I described today are my own and should not be taken as a monolithic expression of autistic experience, just an autistic experience. On the flip side, for those of you who might be tempted to write my experience off as that of a high-functioning autistic, I will note three things. Firstly, you are really overestimating how well I function based on what you see of me working in an area of my special interests. Second, the sort of broad strokes of my experience align really well with those of many other autistic people, including entirely nonverbal. And three, it's worth knowing that the autistic community broadly condemns functioning labels and does not find them to be meaningful descriptors of our experience. They are descriptors that neurotypical people have placed upon us. Incidentally, we also tend to condemn person-first language when it is used to describe us. Person first being person with autism, whereas we tend to use identity first, autistic person. The reason we tend as a community to condemn person-first language is it tends to come from a place of internalized ableism that perceives autism as something that is bad, which you want to try to separate from the person, rather than, as we see it, a neurology that is intrinsic to our existence and experience. So what is my experience of alexithymia, of not being able to name my own feelings? In my experience, alexithymia is sneaky. When I cast my internal light upon some part of my mind or my interoception more broadly, alexithymia is that which remains in the shadow. Interoception is the word that refers to the collection of senses that extend beyond the five, like our sort of sense of our internal body temperature, or our sense of hunger, or our sense of balance. My moment-to-moment experiences are a barrage of senses and feelings that I am functionally unable to filter. Eyes filled with light and color and movement, ears that can't filter out the sounds of electricity in the room or the sound of traffic across the street, let alone handle the joyous cacophony of my own loved ones. I have 2 young children. My skin is painfully attuned to every inch of fabric draped across it, complex scents so intermingled that I can't even begin to disentangle them. And the nonstop taste of my own mouth, along with these tumultuous layers of interoception, all tangled up alongside the affect and emotions that I am similarly unable to filter without dissociation. And because of this type of experience, I'm talking to you right now from my office with the lights turned off and everything turned off so that it's as quiet and dark as possible to help me out. Add to all this the fact that if I'm in a public setting, life has taught me that I need to be deeply attuned to my own masking, which is to say my performance of neurotypical masculine parochial social expectations. And to all the body language and facial expressions of others around me. Lived experience has taught me that not doing this will minimally subject me to embarrassment, but more substantially can put me in real danger, whether that means immediate physical danger, like, for example, it's been clear to me since before I was old enough to understand why that police are dangerous to me, in spite of the shield that is my white skin. And then there's the harder to define dangers of, for example, losing a job or losing other social capital that you can use to keep yourself safe. I don't share this to provoke sympathy, which I don't want and I don't need. I share it because I think it paints a picture that makes it easy to understand what alexithymia means in my day-to-day experiences. In this raging river of sensory and social inputs, it can be difficult, nigh impossible, to isolate the singular ebb and flow of one particular emotion or sense. In cases where I'm agitated and uncomfortable, sorting through the onslaught of data to find and name a nagging source of agitation and discomfort is hard enough on its own, even neglecting the follow-up chore of understanding the discomfort enough to problem solve how to alleviate it. Alexithymia is sneaky, for it hides in the shadow and wake of the inputs and information that surround it. To this, I'll now add another layer. Society has systematically gaslit me into not believing my own feelings, even when I am able to isolate and understand them. In a sense, I would make the claim, rooted in my own experiences, that alexithymia is not just a byproduct of neurology, which is to say nature, it's actually also a result of enculturation, which is to say nurture. I've mentioned previously the empirically recorded tendency of autistic people to hyper-empathize affectively, and how we're often misdiagnosed with states of being like borderline personality disorder. For those unfamiliar with borderline personality disorder, it's sometimes described by people in that community as big feelings disorder. That's a gross oversimplification, but it's something that resonates with people in that community. All this is to say, when I am not dissociated, I experience big feelings, soaring highs, abyssal depths, and all the frenetic traversal of the space between. Throughout my life, but especially as a child, for society seems to find much enjoyment in policing the feelings of children, I have often been tacitly or explicitly told that my feelings are wrong in either magnitude or some more nebulous qualia. I might be upset at perceived injustice only to be met with apathetic disdain, or overwhelmingly joyous at some new idea or experience, only to be met with bemused judgment for my strangeness. Judgment in both cases magnified by the fact that I naturally stim and experience tics in the wake of big feelings. If you're unfamiliar with the word stim, it's a word that refers to self-stimulatory behavior that is often used to support emotional regulation. One good neurotypical example of stimming is the way that many of you likely swear and bounce around after you stub your toe. Everybody stims, but autistic people stim more, hand flapping, echolalia, lots of different ways. I can't begin to relate how many moments where my joy has been immediately turned to shame by condescension, by the condescension and how others react to the way my body reacts. In short, through how others have tended to respond to my experience of big feelings, I learned not to trust my own feelings. And similar gaslighting was part and parcel to my interoceptive experiences as well, with my senses of hunger, body temperature, and so forth constantly being called into question by those around me who felt certain that I must actually be feeling differently. So here I am, alexithymic, filled with feelings, but struggling to surface and name them, as well as struggling to believe my own feelings even when I accomplish that. This is no small thing, since those feelings inevitably point to something I need to notice, things like hunger, overheating, and illness in the case of interoception, things like the mistreatment of myself or others in the case of affect. And in a turn that may feel strange to some, this all leads me to a bizarre sense of camaraderie with my fields of expertise, by which I mean both mathematics and mathematics education. A collective disciplinary experience of alexithymia. Mathematics education is alexithymic. Now, to appease pedants among us, I acknowledge that it might be more accurate to say that I see a strong and meaningful analogy between my own experience of alexithymia and what I have experienced or otherwise gleaned of the collective experience of our field. But for our purposes today, I think mathematics education as alexithymic is more poetically accurate, minimally because it humanizes our field in a manner reflective of the fact that our field is human practice among humans. And also in the sense that it's in keeping with the broader pattern of embodied metaphor in how we develop and employ language. So mathematics education is alexithymic, rendered so by the dynamic interplay of nature and nurture. Attending to nature first, I'm not going to mention yet the various ontological, epistemological, or axiological assumptions that some people might expect me to talk about. Though those are foundational, the same way that we might imagine nature in the nature-nurture binary is foundational. Ultimately, our choice of values are just that. They're a choice, made and reified over time. So instead, I'm going to conceptualize those things alongside nurture, for it's through nurture that they are reified. Instead, in talking about nature and connecting back to my own experiences, I think mathematics education has a natural predisposition towards alexithymia for much the same reason I do. It is definitionally subject to so many concerns, data streams, and collective feelings that surfacing just one or identifying which are important is an absolutely colossal task. Mathematics education is an almost absurdly transdisciplinary thing, sitting as it does at the intersection, at an intersection that invites approaches sourced from such disparate spaces as cultural anthropology, cognitive psychology, discourse analysis, sociology, economics, statistics, political analysis, and mathematics itself, just to name a few. Mathematics education has an incredibly broad collection of objects of study, including students and teachers and communities and curriculum and assessment and policy and minds and bodies, and again, mathematics itself, just to name a few. Most of these categories themselves break down into diverse arrays of study by virtue of how widespread mathematics and mathematics education are globally and historically. there are many mathematics, there are many cultures, there are many stakeholders, businesses, politicians, workers, families, institutions, all with a vested interest in mathematics education, and often the values guiding the interest of one group will be in active conflict with the active desires of another group. In this raging river of inputs and perspectives, it can be difficult, nigh impossible, to isolate the singular ebb and flow of one particular emotion or sense. In cases where we might describe an individual as uncomfortable or where we might describe an individual as uncomfortable or agitated with respect to our field. Sorting through the onslaught of data to find and name a nagging source of agitation is hard enough on its own. Even, again, neglecting the follow-up chore of understanding that discomfort enough to isolate a problem and make sense of how to solve it. Alexithymia, as with me, is sneaky, for it hides in the shadow and wake of the inputs and information that surround it. And there is just so very much surrounding it. Moving now to nurture. Let's begin by considering mathematics itself for a moment before expanding into mathematics education. There's a particular ideology that surrounds and imbues capital M mathematics. The specific interpretation and iteration of math most commonly used, taught, and sanctioned by University of Mathematicians. And that goes on to inform broader hegemonic perspectives of mathematics. Lakov and Nunez termed this ideology the romance of mathematics, a name that frankly resonates quite well with my own experiences of having internalized that ideology over the course of years spent in math departments, alongside, of course, my prior exposure to the hegemony through media and K-12 schooling. Lakov and Nunez share 7 pillars of this ideology, which I'll describe and elaborate on more deeply in a little bit as I place them into communication with some commonplace aspects of hegemonic ideology surrounding math ed. But in short, the romance of mathematics is a beautiful story, a lived extension of Campbell's monomyth, analogous in this sense to the monomythic ideologies seen in careers like policing, which perpetuates the mystique of the mathematician with a capital M, as someone who is more than mere mortal, more intelligent, deeper, visionary. Now, of course, not everyone who believes in this monomyth will believe in all 7 tenets. And in fact, there will be some who nominally reject all of them, even though there may be patterns in their choices and behavior consistent with at least partially internalizing the romance. I would argue that this remains true of myself as I continue to try to disentangle myself from that internalized hegemony. But in a broad cultural sense, the romance provides the standard folk theory for what mathematics is for our culture. Expanding now to mathematics education, I'm going to use the breakdown of ontology, epistemology, and axiology. If you're not familiar with those words, I am going to define each of them before using them. The sort of go-to thing, the hegemonic thing, is to start with ontology. And I'm going to go ahead and do that here because it doesn't matter much what order I put them in. Bear in mind that these are actually deeply interrelated, like they're not mathematically separable, despite the fact that I'm making the pragmatic choice to separate them in our discussion today. Hopefully some of those connections will become clear as the talk continues. So, in considering the hegemonic ideology of mathematics education, focusing on conceptualizing the nurture of alexithymia in our disciplinary culture, let's consider some prevailing trends in aspects of ontology, epistemology, and axiology that embody that nurtured ideology. Ontology is the philosophy of being. It deals with how we perceive and operationalize a notion of reality. Far from concrete or immutable, our sense of what is real and how we respond to that reality can be fluid and even contradictory. Ontology establishes invisible boundaries around what is considered possible or meaningful, made visible through the ongoing clash between marginalized ontologies and governing societal understandings. Now, despite the impossibly large array of possible ontologies, ontology tends to merit little discussion and research methodology debates, especially those of quantitative methodology. This might be reasonably ascribed to historical context. In many research spaces, positivist framing and its analogs have been nominally discarded, but never replaced, leaving this static white noise. Thus, there's a certain kind of mostly unquestioned ontological realism typically taken as a default point of departure, because that ontological realism was the foundation for positivism. That is to say, it's a component of our field's methodological center, comprised of beliefs such as there are facts of the matter about ontology which are objective. Ontological disputes are serious in that they are neither trivially easy to solve nor merely rhetorical, and either the meaning of relevant existential quantifiers is not sensitive, except in mundane ways, to the context of utterance, or even if it is so sensitive, there's exactly one best candidate for meaning of an existential quantifier that is of essential relevance to ontology. To phrase that in less jargony language, it's common to believe that there exist unquestionable ontological facts, that ontological disagreements are serious, and by proxy, other ontologies are flawed, and the facts exist in some way independent of how we think, talk, experience, conceptualize, and so forth. The primacy of these beliefs is sufficient that in cases where I or my peers have discussed ontology, epistemology, and axiology, tensions sometimes manifest when ontology is not the thing we talk about first. Relevant to mathematics specifically, I note that similarities exist between ontological realism as the fault with commonplace views of mathematics, and in particular, the romance of mathematics. Now, again, Lakoff and Nunez give 7 pillars of the romance. I think 4 are particularly relevant to talking about ontology. Math is an objective feature of the universe. Mathematical objects are real. Mathematical truth is universal, absolute, and certain. What human beings believe about mathematics, therefore, has no effect on what mathematics really is. Mathematics would be the same even if there were no human beings or beings of any sort. Though mathematics is abstract and disembodied, it is real. Mathematicians are the ultimate scientists, discovering absolute truths, not just about this physical universe, but about any possible universe. And the mathematics of physics resides in physical phenomena themselves. There are ellipses in the elliptical orbits of planets. Fractals are in the fractal shapes of leaves and branches. Logarithms are in the logarithmic spirals of snails. This means, in some sense, that the book of nature is written in mathematics from the perspective of the romance of mathematics. So all of this suggests that ontological realism probably has a unique hold on, or at least a unique relationship to, the methodological center of mathematics education. It suggests how participation in this cultural narrative, the romance, may have shaped our beliefs and norms outside the realm of pure disciplinary mathematics to the extent that such a distillation exists. Moving on to epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowledge and knowing. It's central to the work of researchers, ostensibly per our positivist-shaped void, tasked with knowledge production. Whereas traditional Western philosophy constructed epistemology as outside of or prior to culture, the true span of epistemic consideration is much wider. Consideration of the often written rules of what counts as knowledge, of who can be considered knowledgeable, and what knowledges are valorized or marginalized are all keys to epistemic consideration. So more perhaps than any other categories of worldview that we're discussing right now, epistemology often receives a great deal of explicit consideration, a trend powerfully visible in the reflections and writings of researchers. Here's such a reflection from Rosenberg. Quote, "What takes people in about the scientists is the grand display they make of the machinery by which their petty findings are dredged up. explanations in technical language of how the data was collected and how much of it, how different factors were weighted, what safeguards were built against distorted interpretation, etc. Actually, instead of a portrait of society, what one gets is a view of the sociologist's workshop with some charts on the wall, end quote. So here, Rosenberg is reflecting on the valuing of epistemology reflected in published works of much social science research, while also alluding to the lack of coherence between the goal he perceives in research, to paint a portrait of society, and its outcomes, some charts on the wall. Almost incidentally, Rosenberg also surfaces a distinction between what aspects of epistemology are the object of focus versus those which are left tacit. For example, much explicit attention is given to the questions of what counts as data, i.e., what counts as usable pre-analysis information and observation, and to developing rules regarding how that data gives rise to knowledge. In contrast, it is commonly unquestioned that it's possible to be objective, that researchers are the only, or at least the primary, people to qualify, tongue-tied, that researchers are the only or primary people qualified to guide the questions being asked and the outcomes of research, and that knowledge itself is cumulative and not internally contradictory or otherwise in tension with itself. The commonplace epistemic goal of research frames its goal as one of surfacing absolute or general principles related to given measures based on the noticing of empirical regularity, a goal which I note stands on a foundation of ontological realism. So here is a very clear place where ontology and epistemology are connected and functionally inseparable. As with ontology, the epistemic assumptions around math ed and its methodological center reflect our field's relationship to mathematics, and by proxy, our relationships to Platonism, Cartesianism, and other relevant philosophies. Our epistemic values are informed by the epistemic values of mathematics. So again, connecting to Locke's 7 pillars, I mentioned 4, talking about ontology. Here's another 2. Since logic itself can be formalized as mathematical logic, mathematics characterizes the very nature of rationality. Since rationality defines what is uniquely human, and since mathematics is the highest form of rationality, mathematical ability is the apex of human intellectual capacities. Mathematicians are therefore the ultimate experts on the nature of rationality itself. So, as with ontology, it seems that our participation in this cultural narrative, the romance of mathematics, may have contributed to shaping our beliefs and norms outside pure disciplinary mathematics. And tending finally to axiology, handily my favorite of the bunch. Axiology is the study of ethical and aesthetic value. It deals with the intrinsic and extrinsic principles that shape our perception and practice. Axiology is oft overlooked in methodological consideration, but palpably shapes every aspect of our research. Our sense of how we do good while doing research, our sense of what questions are interesting or worthwhile, and even our sense of what we expect good research to look like, as for example, grammar, vocabulary, organization. Adding complexity, these values exist not just in the researcher, but also separately and rarely identically in the products and practices of research itself. So in our field's methodological center, it could be said that axiological values follow from or are built on the foundation created by ontological and epistemological beliefs. Ethically good research is research that aligns with ontological realism, follows its associated epistemic rules for knowledge production, and ultimately is perceived to succeed in surfacing or contributing to surfacing absolute or general principles related to given measures based on empirical regularity. Aesthetically good research is research that fulfills the socially constructed aesthetics of objectivity. It looks like familiar research already positioned as objective. It's got familiar section names. It's got familiar sentence construction. It's got familiar jargon. It doesn't trigger strong emotional reactions, which would signal subjectivity, and it tries to draw implications across as broad a population as possible. Work that does not adopt these sorts of appearances can be met with swift exclusion. And again, this connects to Locke's 7 pillars of the romance of mathematics. So I've already given 6 of them above. Here's the last one. Mathematics is the queen of sciences. It defines what precision is. The ability to make mathematical models and do mathematical calculations is what makes science what it is. As the highest science, mathematics applies to and takes precedence over all other sciences. Only mathematics itself can characterize the ultimate nature of mathematics. In other words, in our values system, mathematics and its subsumed cultural characteristics are commonly perceived as strictly hierarchically superior to other forms of reasoning, knowing, and being. So let's connect back to embodied experience of alexithymia now that we've laid a conceptual foundation. Taken together, what all that I've discussed above leaves us with is this hegemonic ideology that surrounds and imbues mathematics and mathematics education individually and cumulatively. This ideology generally operates to exclude emotions, notably, but not solely, anger. Now, let me briefly note that the generally intersectionally privileged members of our culture who will tend to benefit most from its maintenance are actually allowed to express anger and have it not count. Unintentional math pun. The image of a Western allo cis heterosexual abled white man metaphorically frothing at the mouth while calling everyone else a snowflake is literally a meme at this point. A meme I find doubly amusing in the sense that snowflakes are delicate white things, and we all know who that term best describes in moments like these. Whereas anger that disrupts the status quo or is otherwise expressed by someone whose existence disrupts the status quo can be subject to immediate exclusion from the realm of acceptable conversation within our nurtured ideology. In short, connecting back to my own embodied experience of alexithymia through how others tend to express the dominant ideology of our discipline and responding to the feelings of those of us on the margins, we are gaslit and taught to ignore, exclude, or otherwise distrust our own feelings. They are threats to objectivity, threats to our respectability, and threats to those of us who currently hold the most cultural capital in this space. So I note that the fact that I need to devote substantial conscious attention to my own alexithymia arises out of my desire for survival, absolutely antithetical to a desire for destruction. It is important that I notice when I'm sick that I might heal myself, to notice when I'm hungry that I might nourish myself, to notice when I'm being exploited or manipulated that I might extricate myself. If I don't devote that conscious attention to surfacing and analyzing my affective and interoceptive feelings, then I do not experience healing, I do not experience nourishment, and I do not experience safety. If I don't pay careful attention to the ebbs and flows of the roaring river, if I don't unlearn the gaslighting that I so deeply internalized, the net result is my destruction, a time-delayed implosion, a lived decay. By the same token, it's necessary for our field and we, its constituents, to devote substantial conscious attention to our own alexithymia. This need arises not out of a desire for the destruction as our gaslighters and gatekeepers might treat it, but out of desire for survival. I mean this with regard to many feelings, including joy and sadness, but I find cause today to highlight anger. Anger is not a threat. It is an invitation to notice something that is wrong and work towards building something better. It is a spotlight by which we might notice what rots within our field and practice and excise it. I've spoken mostly in broad terms up to this point, knowing as I do that somewhere between many and all of you in attendance have your own experiences of anger with respect to our field. But lest this seem purely theoretical, let me quickly point to 3 specific ways I regularly experience anger with respect to our field. 1, neoliberalism consumes and commodifies marginalized identities. Marginal identities are rendered valuable to researchers as commodities, opportunities on the front end of research, and products on the back end. On top of that, Marginal identities are only rendered valuable to schools and teachers insofar as they are able to achieve in terms set by the dominating class. 2, institutional leadership continues to make choices in a manner that protects the privileged from even experiencing, let alone grappling with, the anger of the marginal. And 3, compromise continues to be idealized despite the flatly immoral character of what it means to compromise between just and unjust. I'll now bring this talk to a close by paraphrasing, largely quoting, but making a few modifications to make it more relevant to us, the words of Audre Lorde. For those words have touched me deeply, and they hold deep relevance for our conversation today. Quote, any discussion among us about racism, allo-cis heteropatriarchy, ableism, classism, and so forth must include the recognition and the use of anger. This discussion must be direct and creative because it is crucial. We cannot allow our fear of anger to deflect us nor seduce us into settling for anything less than the hard work of excavating honesty. We must be quite serious about the choice of topic and the angers entwined within it, because rest assured, our opponents are quite serious about their hatred of us and what they are trying to do here. And while we scrutinize the often painful faces of each other's anger, please remember that it is not our anger which makes me caution you to learn the norms of the hegemony. It is this hatred which lurks in our practice, that urge to destroy us all if we truly work for change rather than merely indulging in academic rhetoric. This hatred and our anger are very different. Hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals, and its object is death and destruction. Anger is a grief of distortions between peers, and its object is change. But our time is getting shorter. We've been raised to view any difference as a reason for destruction and for the marginalized and the privileged to face each other's angers without denial or immobility or silence or guilt is itself a heretical and generative idea. It implies peers meeting upon a common basis to examine differences and to alter those distortions which history has created around our difference. For it is those distortions which separate us, and we must ask ourselves, who profits from all of this? We use whatever strengths we have fought for, including anger, to help define and fashion a world where all our peers can grow, where our children can love, where the power of touching and meeting another person's difference and wonder will eventually transcend the need for destruction. For it is not the anger of the marginalized which is dripping down over the globe like a diseased liquid. It is not my anger that launches rockets, spends over $60,000 a second on missiles and other agents of war and death, slaughters children in cities, stockpiles nerve gas and chemical bombs, sodomizes our daughters and our earth. It is not the anger of the marginalized which corrodes into blind, dehumanizing power, bent on the annihilation of us all unless we meet it with what we have. Our power to examine and to redefine the terms upon which we will live and work. Our power to envision and to reconstruct anger by painful anger, stone upon heavy stone, a future of pollinating differences and the earth to support our choices. Again, thank you all so much for joining me today. I appreciate you all, and even without knowing you, I extend to you my love. In solidarity, I look forward to our ongoing conversations and collaborations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowers. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure that others did as well. We have some emoji responses in the participant window of different varieties. Amy says, thank you for this, very interesting and eye-opening. I am going to turn microphones back on, let's see, so that you may unmute yourselves. And so we'll start now with the question and answer, and we do encourage dialogue with these. This is not sort of a sage on the stage setup, you know, this is a dialogic setup. And I wanted to just mention again that a written version of Dr. Bowers' talk is available on the Institute's events page, and I will put that link again in the chat box. So please unmute yourselves and ask questions or put them in the chat box, and I will moderate the chat. I have a feeling that some of our international friends may be an hour off because of the US changing to daylight saving time last week. Yeah. Luckily, we'll have to do that over beyond next year, but I was thinking that that might have affected some of the international people. Yasmin, yes. Please speak up.
Yes. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
David, sorry. Thank you so much for the conversation. I have a question that might just be a silly question, but I read a book that was called A Community with No Anger. And it was a story of an up north community in Canada where anger didn't exist because they couldn't do with it. Anger meant dying. So if you get angry at someone or somebody get angry at you, you can't really, it was such a community of they needed to do it together or they couldn't survive.
Yeah.
So anger didn't mean anything. How would you think about that?
So when you're in a collective space and you align your collective interests, I think it's not just possible, it's easy to live without anger. And that's not even unique to people. This is the case with animals as well. There have been some interesting cases where apes have had their most violent males die off, and then the women in the group have taken over and totally reframed the culture of the space. But I think in the sort of larger global context, at least within the perceptible future, I don't think it's possible for me to live without anger just because there's so very much to be angry about. Not because I long for or desire anger, but because there are so many people being hurt so often, and it's not okay.
I can't find the raise hand button. Oh, there. Okay.
That's okay. Go ahead, Anna.
But there's Dave Wagner's before me. So
No, but you started looking before
okay,
I
looking for it.
Anna, you want to go ahead?
Okay. Sorry about that, others online.
Won't be.
Thank you, Dave, for the wonderful talk. And I only after started speaking, I remember I talked to you before on PME last year. Yeah, which was supposed to be the year before last. I just want to comment on a small part of the talk, which is the romance of mathematics. Yes.
Yeah.
Suddenly I start thinking, I wonder who thinks this, because we obviously read a lot of that, like mathematics, the queen of sciences.
Yeah.
So people who think that way have definitely published like historically books. We get a lot of that, but it would be interesting to know, although I do not want to do that research because I don't like the methods of research that we use, but I still question, the question came up, who thinks like that still? Would be interesting to know, because I wonder if mathematicians think that, like practicing mathematicians, and also other scientists, because only from my like anecdotal day-to-day conversations, like I don't get that a lot, and I am even more interested to know about other scientists, like people in physics and chemics and biology, because once someone told me, like, what do you do there in that department? Do you even do research? It's like there was the opposite of this romantic view. So yeah, I wonder if we could pinpoint who thinks that way and why do we buy into it, and why a lot of the media buys into it.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing more about a lot of that as well. I know out of my personal experiences that I would say almost every math professor I worked with over the age of 40 as a grad student subscribed pretty heavily to the romance of math. I will also say that it varies from institution to institution and department to department. But yeah, it makes sense to me in some sense that it's taken so hold of the media. I briefly mentioned the monomyth, and obviously the monomyth does not actually describe all stories everywhere, despite Campbell's claim. Like, that's not true. You have to really flatten culture to try to make that true. But ever since he published that, a lot of American media has really embraced it for all of their storytelling. Like, the vast majority of American media produced since Campbell's monomyth has followed the monomyth to some extent or other. And because of that, if they're ever going to talk about mathematics, it makes sense to me that it would have these monomythic romance of mathematics characteristics.
Dave Wagner.
You're muted.
Thank you, David. This is a bit of a tangential question, but I know that you're good with tangents. So
I like that.
First of all, as a first to say before I ask my question, I don't think of anger as an opposite of love. I think of well, opposites are always cultural, but a better opposite of love would be disinterest, maybe, because anger is often very closely related to love. But anyway, some years ago, I was very interested in asking people about times that they found themselves feeling love when they're doing mathematics. So, I mean, it's complicated because people were wondering, well, what do you mean by love? Which had nice conversations and stuff. And I did a one-page paper at PME on this, just to allow myself the ability to go to the PME. But those were really interesting conversations. And I was wondering, because I didn't know what your talk was where it was exactly going to go. One of the things I was hoping you'd talk about, and it doesn't discount what you did talk about, but I was wondering about what it would be like to do mathematics, angry mathematics, because it would very much be a lot like loving mathematics, I think. But anyway, so I just put that for you there to take with however you want to take it.
There was more than one. There was more than one earlier version of this talk where I talked a lot more about love specifically for exactly the reasons you're describing. I absolutely do not see it as antithetical to anger. I think the apathy, as you suggested, is probably a more accurate antithesis, more meaningful, more personally meaningful at any rate. Yeah, and by that same token, I think doing math with anger is also a type of doing math with love. At least the version of it that I would be interested in is a personal sort of connection to this. Let me quick share a mathematics problem, and then I'm going to say a few things about it that I think relate to this. Let's see. If I can find it without waiting a great deal of time. Here it is. All right, here's a link to a math problem. This is a math problem that I first encountered and solved in my spare time out of pure interest while I was a high school teacher. The basic problem is you start out with like a square sheet of paper, and there's a coin on each of the four corners. Your goal as the player is you're blindfolded and you want to get them to either all be heads up or all tails up, like all facing the same direction. So you can flip them blindfolded however much you want. When you're ready to have your answer checked, you say, okay, master game maker, check my answer. And if it's right, they tell you it's right. And if it's wrong, they tell you it's wrong, and then spin the square a random number of times. And then turn taking continues. And what's interesting about this problem is if you were to completely map out all the possible moves, choices, and everything, you get a really big map. But then with the power of abstraction, you can narrow it to a much, much smaller map, you know, with 4 different states of being in the game field instead of 16. And when I solved this problem, the thing it drove home most to me was how intensely powerful abstraction is. Like, obviously, up to this point, I've been doing plenty of mathematics. I was very familiar with abstraction, but this one impacted me in a really visceral way. And it had this sort of slow burn reaction from me over the course of the next few years, where every time I saw people getting mathematized, my experience of that abstraction constantly made me pause to wonder, like, what's going on with our abstraction of people? In some sense, it's almost definitionally dehumanizing to abstract humans. Not to say that there aren't places where you can find value in doing that, but that problem, I experienced a lot of love and a lot of anger over the course of a shocking amount of time.
Chezak, I hope I've said that correctly, but probably not.
It's all right, Kazak. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, David, thank you so much. That was a really very interesting thought there. I'm just a high school math teacher, so I'm really unfamiliar with a lot of the theoretical aspects. But I just kind of have 2 questions on a more practical level that I think you might have probably some insight and some interest in it. So I'm just kind of curious on 2 levels. One, so alexithymia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This alexithymia, like, so often just on a practical issue, you know, when students are in the classroom, I'm trying to understand what they're thinking.
Yeah.
The practical problem of how do I kind of get information from you as to kind of how you're both kind of on a mathematical content level thinking about a problem going through, and then also kind of the emotional level is important as well. I want to say, like, are you freaking out about this problem, like because something's panicking you, something like that. So on first question would just be on a practical level, I would say in kind of negotiating with alexithymia, what's a way a math educator can kind of, you know, how can I get stuff from students? Like, where does the kind of the path of information and insight go? And then second, on the second level as well, is kind of like thinking about anger. So I work with marginalized students in Portland, and my students are, you know, have been unaccommodated to the kind of the standard education system. They've been expelled, or they've dropped out, or had to leave school for a variety of reasons. And, you know, they come to me, they come to my classes with a lot of, I would say, righteous anger. You know, there's very much, they have very clear things that I sympathize with them, they should be angry about. And I'm kind of curious as to kind of where, to a certain extent, I'm not going to be able to absolve them of that anger or say the reasons for your anger is unjustified, or, you know, you should put those feelings aside so that we can do something else. So I'm just kind of curious as to, well, it's going to be present in the classroom in my students' kind of emotional lives.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious on the practical level too, like what do we do with it?
Oh, this is a gloriously big question, and I have many thoughts, and I'm going to lose some of them as I try to share others. So yeah, the anger that our students have and experience is very real and is deeply important to me. And there's a couple barriers to supporting them in their anger. One is, you know, their own sort of alexithymia, where you know, either they haven't had a chance to process a feeling, they haven't had a chance or the means to process their relationship to mathematics, for example, you know, or any of a number of other reasons, and also having a history of going through math courses, you know, especially if you the tongue-tied all the time, every time. Especially if they've had really traditional math class experiences. Those are spaces where you're explicitly supposed to keep all your feels inside. There's no place for your feels in math class. And so the first thing I do is, I think it's really important to have math class feel different. And this means a lot of the obvious things that math educators talk about a lot, like setting up active learning scenarios, complex instruction, creating space for collaboration, establishing positive norms of collaboration, yada, yada, yada. And doing stuff like that for some students will actually alleviate a lot of the anger that they feel with regard to mathematics. I've had particular luck with that with respect to my neurodivergent students over the course of years. On top of that, I also think it's important to be able to express your own anger as a teacher. So I'm very open about my feelings about lots of things in math class. I'm very open about my feelings about standardized assessment. I'm very open about my feelings about whatever curriculum we're using. I'm very open with my feelings, and inevitably some of those feelings are anger. And I find by letting myself express anger with respect to these things, it opens up the space for my students to express their anger with respect to those things, or at least it contributes to making that feel possible to them. And then once they're able to share those angers and frustrations, now we have like a point of connection that we can talk about, you know, and co-construct different futurities from. And sometimes that just means making this math class the best, most positive, like, learning environment it can be. Sometimes it means helping them organize in broader ways. I have a habit and history of helping teach students how to organize for direct action against institutions and administrations, even though that puts me at some risk. But I get, at this point, specifically sought out for it sometimes. Being able to do that helps a lot. And also something that might be really helpful nowadays is Alyssa Dunn has been doing research on teaching on days after. So this is, you know, referring to a different type of anger in some sense. So like community rage when something has happened, the many police killings, for example. And Alyssa's been doing a lot of work to figure out how in interdisciplinary and different types of classes, how to have conversations, how to productively move on, how to teach on days after.
I think that we've covered all the people that had hands raised. We've got some comments in the chat box here. JF in Montreal is talking about writing a paper on mathematics for love, and has some excerpts from Maturana and Rezepka's work. Thank you, Kaza. Good to meet you, and thank you for coming.
I'll write that paper with you if you want.
And I'm just putting in a plug for my other friend, James Dramala here, who has also written about love and mathematics education. If y'all want to read that as well.
Yeah, James comes from an
thank you, Dave.
Augustinian lens.
Thank you, Dave. That's great. Oh, awesome. I'll have to read that. Any other comments or questions for Dr. Bowers or for the group? I think I have cleared out everything in the chat box. Well, thank you all so much. We will respect everyone's time. And the again, the paper version of this is available at the events page of our website. I'll put it right there. And if you click on the paper to load the paper up, Dr. Bauer's email address is on the cover page. So further questions, if you think of something this afternoon and want to send an email, I'm sure that Dr. Bowers would love to receive that. And we will be announcing more seminars. We have 3 in the works for later this year. So please sign up for our mailing list if you would like to be notified automatically about future events. That's also on our website. And I believe that's everything. Dr. Bowers, do you have any closing comments or want to say anything?
Nothing profound. Y'all are the best. It has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you all today. And I look forward to future conversations and future collaborations. I adore all of you.
And Amy has asked, how do we sign up for the mailing list? If you just go to our website, I've linked it there in the chat box. There's a button at the top that's you can subscribe to it. Yes, thank you, Dr. Bowers. This was a wonderful talk, and we hope to see everybody at the next seminar. Thank you so much.